Hello my bookish friends out there in booktube land, and welcome to another episode of Tristan and the Classics. I've got a wrap up for you, the books that I read in March. So without further ado, let's dig in, shall we? Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell. So I don't know about you, but in March I had quite a varied read, and there's 4 books that I want to share with you, and I'm going to add one from last month that I read, February, sorry, because it was a brilliant book and I never did a wrap up for February. I might explain why later, who knows. Let's see how this video goes, eh? So the first book that I read was one by Graham Greene called Our Man in Havana. And do you know what? It was quite a good book. I wouldn't say there was anything special about it. It's a very tongue-in-cheek, satirical look at the British Secret Service in sort of the 60s, 20th century, 1960s. The story itself follows a character called Wormold, who's a vacuum cleaner salesman in Havana, hence Our Man in Havana. And somebody walks into his life who is recruiting for the British Secret Service. And sort of Wormold gets sucked into it because basically he realises that he can get paid extra to support his daughter, who's constantly spending things and is going out with the notorious chief of police, who is a torturer. And he needs a bit of cash. He's just bought a horse. And he realises if he works for the Secret Service as their only man out here, he can just make up reports and get paid for it. He also gets to charge expenses for any agents he recruits. And so he sets about making up agents that he's recruited and claiming expenses from London for his spies. Now, some of the people that he recruits, he uses real people's names and, to make it more plausible. But he never thinks they're going to check up on him. And he starts making up stories about the Cubans building these massive concrete structures out in the jungle. Well, when London hear this, they think Cuba's doing something big and they need to investigate. So they send someone over to join Wormold to help him run operations. And of course, he's rather worried because the woman that's sent over, she begins to suspect that he's just making stuff up because she can never meet any of his agents. There's always an excuse why they don't turn up. And she's just about to call him out on it when one of his agents, who he's made up but used a real name, called Raoul, dies on the way to an airport. And Wormold has said that Raoul was about to go and fly over these structures in the jungle to check them. So when this woman learns that Raoul has died on the way to the airport, she begins to believe all of his agents are real. And interestingly, because the Cubans evidently have a spy spying on Wormold, they've cracked his code for the names of his made-up spies, and they're tracking down these people. And everything gets a bit complex and hijinks, and there's some really funny scenes in it. When he has to go to the bordello to save a stripper who doesn't know him and has to bundle her in the back of a car with nothing but a fur coat on, things really begin to get quite amusing. Now, there's nothing great about the book in the sense of deep meanings and philosophies and hypotheses that are being explored. It is just a straight up satire, and it was very entertaining. So that was my first book, Our Man in Havana by Graham Greene. The next book I read in March was very much a foundational classic. It's really at the heartbeat, the roots of the growing romantic movement's rebellion against the Renaissance. And it is The Sorrows of Young Werther by Goethe, which always makes me laugh. He could have picked a name that didn't rhyme with him. Goethe himself was one of the last great polymaths of the 18th century. Not many people in the world today come close to these ones in their breadth of education and exploration of topics, the deep reservoir of knowledge that this man had. But in The Sorrows of Young Werther, it's written in a diary form, Because Werther, he wants to make his way in the world. He thinks of making himself something great. And he's writing back to his friend. And he's moved on to this village in Germany where he happens to bump into a woman who he is awestruck by. And he falls head over heels in love. And he keeps recounting his day's activity. Very short snippets, but so brilliantly put together. There's just a beautiful lyricism in his writing. And it's so to the point. And because it's diary form and letters sent back to his friend, he obviously talks about himself. He uses the word I a lot, which can be annoying, but because it's diary, you expect it. And you sort of fall into his ways of thinking. And through Werther, Goethe decides to, or examines the deepness of emotions, the indefinable aspects, the incalculable, the unable to experiment parts of the human psyche and feelings, the whole soul of a person, which is really what the Romantic movement was about, that there is sort of an instinctive link with nature and ourselves, which can't be broken down into the atoms, as they would have said back then. Now, in this story, when he meets the girl whom he falls in love with, she already has someone that she's affianced to, but they have this meeting of the minds. And of course, when you are deeply in love, how do you let go? That's the problem Werther has. Now, what's great is he starts off in the first part of the book sort of very optimistic, speaking well of people, loving the rustic life. But then the story of unrequited love drives him almost insane. And the way, there's observations about human character in this, which, you know, the pathos, the deep, deep pathos, which you will recognise if you remember your first love, or maybe you're young. I recommend you read this because you'll relate to it. Now, so much so that at the end of the 18th century, when this came out, people, the young men of Europe, modelled themselves on Werther because he was so deep in his expression of sentiment and sensibility, which marked the beginning very much of the Romantic movement. In fact, it's something that Jane Austen criticises later. If you think of Mrs. Bennet in Pride and Prejudice, you know, oh, my nerves, my nerves. She's talking about sentimentality or sensibility. This was how guys back then, and girls, wanted to show themselves elevated in sentiment. It made you something special, to fall apart when you pass a trickling waterfall in a brook, you know, to cry and weep. And so Goethe, going so far as to feel suicidal over his love, this was a mark of a highly sentimental, a highly sensible character who was in tune with his natural self rather than just the hard Renaissance logic and calculation of the world. This book, probably above all others, drove Romanticism to the front. And you had poets who would commit suicide because they had fallen in love. And, you know, their suicide was just a show. I mean, talk about dramatic. So this was potent stuff. Now, of course, it's got a certain old tone to it in places. It can become a little maudlin, to use want of a better word, at times. But the insights that Goethe has through his main protagonist, who I can't say because it rhymes with Goethe and it just makes me laugh. It feels wrong. Goethe and Werther. The insights he has, some of them, they strike you and you think, yes, I recognise that. And Goethe, you know, a philosopher as well, he and a mathematician, he really got the essence of humanity. And it's a great read. I will be going back and reading this a third time with the explicit intention of doing a deep review on this, and maybe it's a link to the Romantic movement. Because there's a lot in this. This is one of those books that would be good to have in your foundational knowledge where you can see its effect in later books, which is one of the joys of studying literature through history. So that was the second book, The Sorrows of Young Werther by Goethe. Next up in my read for March was the Classics Book Club's first book ever, and that was The Three Musketeers by Alexander Dumas. If you haven't heard of the Classics Book Club, it's a club that's free for you to join. It's started by myself and a wonderful community of readers, and you can find the link to explain it down below for another video. Now, the way to join the book club, there is a Discord site which you can go on, or if you only stay on YouTube, don't worry, there are going to be videos through the month about whatever book we discuss, and you'll be invited to an online discussion at the end of the month. So if you want more details, message me. You can get my details in my YouTube channel and you can email me. So the book Three Musketeers, what a brilliant piece of work. I know it's not everyone's favourite book, but it's undeniably one of the greatest adventure romances, historical romances ever written. Dumas' actual input onto that genre of the adventure romance, it's incalculable. He really drove it forward. Of course, he's called the Lion of French Literature as well. And this book just absolutely rollicks along. You start off with D'Artagnan, the famous D'Artagnan, coming from Gascony, and he's going to Paris because he wants to make a great name for himself, become a guard of either the Musketeers or the Cardinal's guards, and he ends up bumping into three Musketeers when he gets to Paris: Athos, Porthos and Aramis. Now, the story itself, while full of amazing details that genuinely happened in history in a way Dumas pulls them together, is just sublime. The story itself really tracks the idea of true nobility, true honour, because D'Artagnan starts off wanting honour for himself, which means to be better than others, to stand out. But through his friends whom he meets, Porthos, Athos and Aramis, especially Athos, you begin to see him moulding his character. He changes his attitude towards self and the importance of placing others into the equation. You meet other characters like Richelieu with great power. You have King Louis XIII. He obviously has the supreme power in the state, but is he honourable? What about Queen Anne, who is really being oppressed at this time? You have Monsieur Treville, who is head of the Musketeers. Does he have a sense of honour? Is he a good counterfoil to the Cardinal, his enemy? And then in the book, although D'Artagnan is the protagonist, as we talked about in the Classics Book Club, if you join you can find a link to that discussion, one character outsizes everyone. They turn up partway through the book and seem to just get their talons into Dumas and outgrow him even. And that is the character Milady. As we discussed this in the book club, Milady is one of the most wretched villains in all literature. I mean, she is scary. An amoral, conscienceless killing machine. Who doesn't allow anyone to step in her way. And to watch her growth, and with this idea of honour and what makes a truly noble person, everyone has certain qualities about themselves, but is there ever a person who is totally immoral and has no redeeming characters? Maybe that's explored through Milady. Also, a very, very shocking and dramatic ending, which you should pause to think about rather than just accept. Do you agree with what happens at the end of this book? Because it is shocking and it's brilliant. It's also very exciting. You have intrigue, you have secret letters going back and forth, secret missions to, rescue a person. You have the Bastille, not very much, but it's there. You have the ominous Cardinal Richelieu who knows everything, and you have even stealing diamonds, which, you've got to throw that into the mix, as well as a prison break, of all things. It's also very interesting to see the stereotypical heroes and villains which Dumas, in some respects, was right there at the beginning to formulate, and they've never really gone away. I even thought after this about the Marvel characters that we have. So many of them fit the types which were established in this book. So that was the next book, The Three Musketeers. The fourth book I want to share with you has been called by some the best book written in the 20th century. And it's the first ever book I did a read along with, and this one is the one from February. February was a very busy month for me and I didn't get as much reading done, but this one book was brilliant, and it is The Radetzky March by Joseph Roth. Now, Joseph Roth was a Jew. He wrote this book in 1932, just before the Nazis came to power in Germany. And the book itself is sort of the elegy to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which had collapsed at World War I. And there's a fond looking back from Roth on an empire that at least held a group of people together under a glorious ideal. And you sense the vacuum that's left after it's gone, and Germany is pitched into the sort of the very turbulent Weimar Republic and the clashes between, you know, the communists and the nationalists and the socialists. You see, this man has lost his country because being a Jew doesn't have a natural country at this time. Israel is not around. And so belonging to an empire was quite important to him. Now, in the book, he follows the Trotter family. There is a guy at the beginning, the first Trotter. He saves the emperor's life at the Battle of Solferino, and that was a real account. And Joseph Roth has picked that to start the book with. So this man, who's just an ordinary lieutenant, gets elevated to a baron. He doesn't feel comfortable with that. He's lost his roots with the peasants. But his son becomes a bureaucrat. And he is fully for the monarchy, the great Austro-Hungarian monarchy. And then his son, and it's the third Trotter, Joseph Trotter, who is the main focus of the story. He's part of the military in the cavalry, an honourable position. But there is a sort of ennui, a languid, lackadaisical, insipid spirit permeating the Hungarian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the scepticism towards the absolute right of a monarchy. In fact, it's the scepticism towards religion in many respects which begins to undermine the idea of the emperor being appointed by God. And these peoples that are all united in an empire begin to lose their sense of meaning, their sense of focus. And it's fascinating to watch the characters. This book is so hard to explain. It is so real. But the torment of Joseph Trotter's mind, the third Trotter, as he's meant to be part of this glorious cavalry, but there's no more wars for them to fight, and the belief is going, just leaves him hollowed out. And so what you get is, on the one hand, the problems, the decay within that Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was inevitably leading to its demise, but also some of the fanfare, some of the paraphernalia, the ceremony, the pomp and circumstance that was glorious, which was a binding ideal. And it challenges you. Does society need an ideal to unite it? Because it seems it was the only thing that held the empire together. And you see that through the eyes of various different characters, even the old guard beginning to wane on that. And Joseph Trotter's eventual move to the sort of the borderlands of the empire, where there's a lot of mud, coldness, rain. It's just very symbolic of the dying empire and people no longer buying into it, and the rise of the nationalists. You don't see much nationalist uprising. You do see a workers' uprising, but you just see this moral breakdown, a loss of vigour, of energy, of zeal, and yet there's still a fondness of memory in all of it, and just a good story as well. But you can see in this book an author trying to arrange his own thoughts, his own feelings about something. So would I recommend this? I would actually really recommend this, but I would say read it with a pen to make notes either on a pad next to your book or in the margins, because it will force you to slow down and take in what you're reading, and that will help you no end to enjoy this book 3-4 times as much as if you just read it straight through. So that was number 4, The Radetzky March by Joseph Roth. A brilliant book. The last piece of literature that I read in March is from this hefty tome, which is part of my large set of works on Shakespeare. This one covers the histories and the poems. And the play that I read was Henry VI Part 1. In case you're not aware, there are 3 plays on Henry VI, because there's quite a detailed history of a number of characters vying for power, which would eventually lead to the War of the Roses, which is something Shakespeare really wanted to cover. And he starts it in Part 1 of Henry VI, going quite a way back. In this, you have particularly the main character, Lord Talbot, who is the terror of the French, commander of the English forces in France, and is pinning down all of France with the help of the Duke of Burgundy. Well, I'm not going to go through the whole story. That will be for another review of the play when I do a Shakespeare Explained video, which, by the way, if you want to get into Shakespeare, check out my playlist, Shakespeare Explained. Just some of the phrases that Shakespeare uses are just delightful. I mean, here's some of them that are written in here. My thoughts are whirled like a potter's wheel. I know not where I am nor what I do. And what a beautiful piece of imagery. That simile, my thoughts are whirled like a potter's wheel. Well, we know what happens when the clay goes too fast on a potter's wheel. It flies everywhere. What a beautiful description. Hark, countrymen, either renew the fight, this is in the middle of the battle, or tear the lions out of England's coat. Well, of course, the 3 lions are part of the emblems of England. So he's saying to the men, get back into the fight, do not retreat, or if you do retreat, you tear those lions out, you don't belong to the English. So some grand stuff. Here's another one. The day begins to break, and night is fled, whose pitchy mantle overveiled the earth. What a beautiful expression. And there's a couple of others. He just dots them everywhere. Talking about why someone is so angry. One of the characters, who is the Bishop of Winchester, who becomes cardinal, a guy called Beaufort, who was exceptionally powerful and rich at the time, and was behind the forming of the faction of the House of Lancaster, which would eventually fight the House of York. You have him and the guy called Duke of Gloucester, who would end up, his son being Duke of York, would kick off the Wars of the Roses. Well, the cardinal just talks about the avarice, the desire for power that Gloucester has. And then he says, and that engenders thunder in his breast and makes him roar these accusations forth. What a great way of saying he's getting mad. The reason he's throwing forth these comments is because thunder is engendered in his breast and roars forth. The ability for Shakespeare to create colour, to create character, to throw you into a scene is magnificently woven through the words. The words are so vivid that you begin to see aspects of the play or the scene which they could never put on the theatre platform. And yet he can do it through words. There's a beautiful turn of phrase about time, if I can find it. I marked it down for this especially. Oh, here it is. How about saying before the time is through? We might say, so before the end of this countdown. Not Shakespeare, talking about an hourglass. He says, for ere the glass that now begins to run finished the process of this sandy hour. I mean, that's just majestic. For ere the glass that now begins to run finished the process of this sandy hour. You can see the grains going through the glass. On a theatre stage, they would have seen the glass turn, the sand timer turn. But you couldn't have seen the actual sand, but with the words, it almost becomes this close-up vision in your head. There is just, and this is one of his early histories. I mean, he would get better and better and better. And this is like probably maybe his earliest history, probably the first one. And the way he pins Lord Talbot, who gets into a final fight in which he cannot win, at the time when his own son, who he hasn't seen for years, turns up to fight with him without reinforcements because the lords have failed. They're too busy arguing over power at home to support the war in France. His son turns up, and there's this beautiful moment when he tells his son to leave the battle, save himself, and his son arguing back and saying, yes, but I will, I can't do that. You're my father. And he says, yes, keep the name of Talbot going. And he said, but by fleeing, I will ruin the name of Talbot forever, because his dad is like a hero to the English. And so they have this big dispute, but it's very loving and affectionate. And the way Shakespeare pins the two together, like an indivisible link of father and son in honour and valour. The way he does it is he runs like 3 pages of their conversation all rhyming with each other, showing that they are simpatico. And that's just such a clever piece of literature. And yet it doesn't read like a tacky rhyme. It actually reads like just the most heartrending, moving conversation between a father and son. The father who knows that his son will die if he stays here. The son knowing his father's going to die because he won't flee and won't leave his father. Just absolute genius. And his typical lampooning, very sympathetic Shakespeare was. You get the feeling, I've read Shakespeare for years, since my childhood, and you get the feeling with Shakespeare that he didn't approve of lots in his day. That he was not the raucous, rambunctious person that some tried to make him out to be. He kept away from fights and villainy, unlike a lot of his peers, his contemporaries. He has a little critique of the fact that the lords are all arguing when they all profess one faith. Why should they fall apart? So he's critiquing the church being an avaricious institution rather than holy in God's eyes. The English attitude of the day of Shakespeare was that Joan of Arc was some wench, some whore, some spiritistic witch. That's how the English viewed her. And to keep in harmony with that, he portrays her like that through the mouth of her enemies. But typical of Shakespeare, being able to see life differently, to sympathise with characters when Joan of Arc is burned at the stake or taken to the stake. I'm just going to read to you what words Shakespeare puts in her mouth, giving the idea that actually, was Joan of Arc that bad? He lets her from the grave defend herself to the English, who have called her all sorts of names since her death. I'm going to read it to you because it's that good. She's being led forth and she says, "First let me tell you whom you have condemned. Not me begotten of a shepherd swain," because Joan of Arc actually was born, on a farm. She says, "but issued from the progeny of kings, virtuous and holy, chosen from above by inspiration of celestial grace to work exceeding miracles on earth. I never had to do with wicked spirits. I'm not a witch. But you," pointing to the English lords, who were heroes to the English in Shakespeare's day, she says, "but you that are polluted with your lusts, stained with the guiltless blood of innocence, corrupt and tainted with 1,000 vices, because you want the grace that others have, you judge it straight a thing impossible to compass wonders but by help of devils. So because you are so vile, you can't conceive that the wonders performed by Joan of Arc in leading the French to victory, you can't conceive that they can possibly come from something good because you are so corrupted at heart." And then she says, "No, misconceive, Joan of Arc hath been a virgin from her tender infancy," because they call her a whore and a slut, "chaste and immaculate in very thought, whose maiden blood, thus rigorously effused," as in killed, "will cry for vengeance at the gates of heaven," when they have consistently said she's a demon from hell. And those few words Shakespeare gives to the dying Joan of Arc, which were so contrary, so anathema to the English patriotic spirit, their hatred of the French, that it was remarkable a playwright would give such potent voice to an enemy of Britain who is also a woman. And actually, when you analyse the words, her accusations are quite right against the corrupt English leaders who shed the blood of thousands in France. So that was another treat. So those are the bits of books and literature I've read in March. What have you read? Are there any of these that take your fancy? I just want to mention a couple of things at the end of this video, so please stick around, don't jump on. They may be to your benefit. First of all, if you want to join the Classics Book Club, go and look at the link below for the video on joining the Classics Book Club. I'll put it there. If you don't feel technically minded and you worry that because you can't go on Discord, you will miss out on the book club, well, let me tell you, you can still read along. I will still tell you what's being read. I will still come on live 2 weeks into the read so we can discuss, or I can discuss mainly, themes and ideas beneath the story to sort of maybe jog your thinking along or to give you an angle. And of course, you don't have to agree with me all the time. On that live, you can write comments to me and I'll read them as I go along. At the end of the month, there will be an online discussion via Zoom, which I know most of you can use, thanks to the pandemic. If you want the contact details for that, you can message me towards the end of the month. My email is attached to this channel. But if you want to join Discord, where there's an ongoing discussion, there's some brilliant characters on there, amazing people. Discord's not as hard as you imagine, and I have got a video explaining how to use it, so I'll put that as the second link below, so you can check that. Plenty of people, most there have never been on Discord in their life, okay? So you can do it. The next thing I want to mention, I posted the video before this at the wrong time in the week so that it wasn't so visible to those on YouTube, even if you were a subscriber. And I've just started a series called The History of the English Language. Part 1, just talking about the beginning with the Angles and Saxons. So if you want something fascinating to look at and see how the English language has grown from this small, basic language to being spoken worldwide and influencing culture like no other language before, with even, it's probably more influential than even Greek, then go and watch it. I think you might be pleasantly surprised at the video itself. And last of all, just to let you know, you Shakespeare lovers out there, one of the reasons I read Henry VI is because I've already been working for a few months on this, but I'm now working my way through the plays again with a specific target of sharing some information on YouTube, going through more speeches and describing the stories and plays, but also because I'm slowly building up some courses for anyone who's interested. Those courses, there will be a grand course, which is how to get into Shakespeare, how to understand Shakespeare, various aspects of how Shakespeare writes, techniques, the world of his day, how the theatre was run, a lot of stuff. And analysing the great tragedies, looking at what comedy is, the power of histories and their drawbacks, the rhetoric, how he conjures images and sensations and puts words in people's mouth. All that will be in the grand course, but I'm also going to be doing smaller courses devoted, hopefully, to individual plays. And the one I'm currently working on, which will probably be the first course released, please tell me if you're interested in this, is on Romeo and Juliet. I'm going to create a short course which will lay out what all of the acts are about, maybe even scene by scene. Then some of the significant themes and how Shakespeare develops it. Underlying ideas which may reveal Shakespeare's mind. Techniques of writing. If you haven't seen my video on iambic pentameter, please go and see that. I think you'll enjoy it. It's a longer one than you'll normally get. Most people do iambic pentameter in 5 minutes, but this really goes through iambic pentameter so you understand it fully. And in the plays, we'll look at characters, their development, why a particular quality is at the centre. Is Shakespeare passing judgment on the morality of his day? And so if you're homeschooling, or you know someone who's at college or at high school, or you just want to know more Shakespeare for yourself, then look out for these upcoming courses. They're not going to be coming out in the next few weeks because I've read them a lot. I've studied Shakespeare a huge amount. But now that I'm making a course, I'm really refocusing all of that study to make it as crystal clear as possible. So please let me know what you think about this idea of mine. Slowly I'll build courses on lots of the plays. Maybe leave a comment which play you would really like a course to be done on. But there you go. So that was my wrap up and a few announcements. Yeah, there we go. I hope that you are having a great time reading last month and going into this month. And until the next time we meet on this channel, I wish you joy in your reading.